My name is Greenwald, and yeah, this is what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk mostly. You're going to listen, but at the end you can ask questions if you want. So let's start off with the survey. Show of hands, how many people here write React Native every day? Only a few of you, and like some of you work at Wix. Okay, how many people here write React Native sometimes? Okay, we're getting there. How many people here wish they wrote React Native? Okay, fine. So no, that's good. That's important. We have a lot of aspirational, what we call it, which is good, because this way I can tell you things and you won't know if I'm lying. What's to talk about? What do we want to talk about here? We want to talk about React Native, reusing code, architecting our app in a way that makes it work. What does any of that mean? What's React Native? React Native makes a promise. Okay, a long time ago, like, I don't know, 3 years ago, which is a long time in JavaScript world, maybe 4, React Native, Facebook came out and said, we have a new framework. Blah, 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 blah. It does a lot of cool things. Blah, blah, blah. It's called React Native, and this approach yields about 85% reuse of app code. I lifted this quote directly from a blog post of theirs. I can't remember who wrote it. Probably doesn't really matter. The point is that Facebook says that they can reuse a lot of code, which sounds like a good thing. I mean, I shouldn't have to convince you that reusing code is good, right? It's the holy grail of software development. That's what we want to do. We want to reuse code. The question that you have to be asking yourself, the question that I was asking myself when I saw this 3 odd years ago, was not, is this good, but is it true? And not, is it true, like, is Facebook lying? I assume they're not lying. They seem like, yeah, I don't know. But let's assume they're not lying, okay? But what I was really worried about, is it true for me? Like, sometimes a big company comes out with a framework and says, yeah, this framework is great. Yeah, well, no kidding, because you wrote the framework for your exact use case. So, of course, it fits the use case perfectly. But what about my use case? Maybe your framework gets you 85% app code reuse. But me, maybe I'll get, I don't know, 60, 50, 40, 30, 100. I don't know what I'll get. Can I trust this? That was the question I was asking, if this is just something Facebook can get or if it's something I can get. And 3 odd years later, the good news is my answer is, yeah, I think so. In fact, I would say that I get more than 85% in the parts of the code I see. Most of my daily work, if I had to pick a number, unscientifically made up, not based on anything except my gut, 95% maybe. So yeah, it's great, right? But of course there are caveats. Nothing's perfect. And that's really what this talk is about. Where are the caveats? Where are the gotchas? What do you have to do to get that 85%? And where can you get it? Where can't you get it? But let's take a step back. When we talk about reusing code, what are we talking about? I mean, it sounds good, right? But when we move past the buzzword of code reuse, what do we mean? I like to categorize, or I like to group all of code reuse into basically 3 different things that I have found when I'm talking to different people that this is what they're thinking of. Okay? The first is between Android and iOS. This is probably the most common. When I said the word code reuse, I guess most of you thought about reusing code between Android and iOS. Right? And maybe if you know somebody with Windows Phone, that too. But basically Android and iOS. Right? And that's a legitimate kind of code reuse, but there are others. For example, reusing between your mobile app and your web apps. I've had many people come up to me and say, hey, look, you know, I have a React app. This sounds like React Native. I don't know. It's got the same word in it. At least half of React Native is React. So presumably I can reuse code, right? Can I? And that's something we're going to talk about. And then finally, there's another kind of code reuse, which is reusing code between multiple projects. Now, this is, we're not going to talk about a lot, but we will talk about briefly. And it's important for those of you especially. How many people here, I guess not that many of you are writing React Native, you said. But of those that write React Native, how many of you work for agencies? Great. So we don't have to talk about this topic. But basically, the idea is that, OK, if you're like me and you work for a big company and you have only one app that your company publishes, then you probably don't want to write code, or it's not that important for you to write code that you can reuse in multiple apps, except that you want to open source some parts of your code that can then be used in other apps, which is part of it. But if you, let's say, work for an agency and you build apps for many clients, then you probably have pieces of boilerplate and infrastructure that you want to reuse across your apps. And that's another kind of code reuse. We'll take them one at a time. Android and iOS and Windows Phone. this is the question we start off by asking. What can I share? Or those people who come from a background of Android and iOS native development start off asking this question. They say, all right, so you tell me that I can share code. Well, what? But that's obviously, for those of us who already write React Native, we know that's the wrong question. The right question is not what can you share, but what can't you share? Because you can share everything. I mean, the default way of working in React Native, when you just take out your IDE and start working, is that every line of code you write, the first line, the 10th line, the 500th line, it's all shared between Android and iOS for free. So the question that we have to start asking, or the mindset that we get into in React Native, is not, oh, how do I share some code? It's how do I not share code? And when do I not want to share code? So when do I not want to share code? Well, I don't know, if you have a different UI, then you probably don't want to share that. And that's probably a good thing to I don't want to get into a huge UX debate, but some people, Apple and Google will tell you that your UI should cater to their platform and look like it's native on the platform. Some big companies are famous for not honoring this and coming up with their own design system. But basically, the UIs, if you're building an app, you probably want your UI to look like it's at home on Android and at home on iOS, so you want a different UI. And maybe there are some features that only apply on one or the other. Maybe not. Funny story, I once worked for an insurance company where they had a problem. This was before React Native, and they had different teams for Android and iOS. And so this was in the United States, and they said that if they ever released a feature by accident on Android 2 weeks before iOS, people would call up and complain. They'd be like, hey, my wife has the feature and I don't. What's up with that? So, but maybe you have some features that are only relevant. Maybe you have something that interacts with NFC and it's only relevant on Android. And so there are things that you can't share. We're not going to get into your product here. You probably have some things you can't share. What's interesting, though, is how do you do that? And React Native gives you some ways to write platform-specific code. Gives you ways to basically say, this code that I'm about to write, I only want to be for Android or only want it to be for iOS. How? Well, option one is the platform module. What does that mean? That means something like this. Okay, this is an old screenshot from a long time ago. But and there's now fancier, nicer, or more ergonomic ways to do this, like platform select. But the fundamental is the same, which is that there's a module that you import from React Native. It's called platform. And in it, there are some methods and variables. Let's say there's a variable called OS, and it will either be, not necessarily either, but it will be, in this case, iOS or Android. And in my render of here I have a view that has, if it's iOS, it says I see her on iOS. And if it's on Android, if you're on Android, it says I see her on Android. Easy peasy. Good? Done? We're done. We can all go home. But of course, there's another way because nothing's simple. The other way is to use file name suffixes. What does this mean? This looks like this. So imagine I have a directory in my app, like in my source code, sorry. And in it, there's a meme builder component, meme builder.js, and it imports an input box. Okay? But I have two input boxes here. I have one input box.android.js and one input box.ios.js. Except when I use it like this. I just say import input box from input box, which is a lie because there is no file anywhere called inputbox.js. But React Native is magic. React Native says no problem. You want the inputbox.js component, which doesn't really exist. Okay, if you're on Android, I'll find the .android.js. If you're on iOS, I'll find the .ios.js. What happens is at compile time, the packager, essentially compile time, the packager runs over all of your code and it says, okay, I'm going to take all of the files that have a generic suffix like .js, plus, if I'm compiling for Android, all the ones that have .android, and I'll skip everything that's .ios. And if I'm compiling for iOS, I do the opposite. I compile everything that's either generic or .ios, and I skip everything from Android, which is a nice solution, yeah? So we have two options. Which one's better? Okay. Show of hands. You have an opinion.
Yeah. What happens when you're building for a Windows phone?
Good point. So I've never tried it. I have to be honest. But no. But essentially, the idea of platform suffix is that you have also .windows.js or whatever the suffix would be. Okay. And that's why I said I was careful. Platform.os doesn't have to be iOS or Android. Okay. It could be neither. It could be the third or fourth or fifth thing. That's the theoretical concept. But who thinks here that using the platform module is a preferable way? And who thinks file name suffixes? So everybody votes file name suffixes. Who thinks it depends? That was a trick question. The answer is always it depends, okay? There's never going to be a question where the answer isn't it depends. All right? The real knowing that it depends is not an accomplishment. Knowing what it depends on is. And I'm not going to embarrass anybody. So I'll just tell you what I think it depends on. It's a matter of preference, okay? Really. But there are there's one main difference between these two options, which I think most of you sensed, which is that the file name suffixes is a compile time selection, okay? The iOS code never gets to the Android device because at compile time it picks the correct code. And the platform module is a runtime selection, which means that every time this view is rendered, it has to say, oh, am I an iOS? Am I an Android? And make that decision. How much does that cost performance-wise? I have no idea. Probably basically nothing. It's not so much the performance I'm concerned about, but the semantics. If I look at a component and I see that there's two code flows, then I assume that maybe in the morning it says good morning, in the evening it says good evening, right? Like there's a component that can go two ways. But that's not the case here. There is no component that can go two ways. There's only one component here. It's just that the input box looks different on different platforms, so I have a different input box. But for the given device that I have in my hand, it's always going to be this one, or it's always going to be that one. So why do you have code that makes it look like there's two? Right? The flip side, and that's I think why a lot of people like file name suffixes. The flip side is that file name suffixes is a pain to deal with. So you have a bug, somebody complains about it. What do? You search the code because you don't remember where it is in your code base. Your code base is huge, right? You search the code and you find some place and you fix it there. But you forgot there were two places that had that code or similar code, and you had to fix that bug in two places, right? Or you're looking at code and you can't remember if you're looking at the iOS one or the Android one because the main difference is that one has an underline in the input box and one has a border. And so now you're confused. Having two files when you really only wanted one is a pain. And so when it's a very small difference, I say just go ahead and use the platform module. It's not such a big deal. If you need to have a thicker border or a thinner border, just use the platform module. If things are significantly different, then the file name suffix is a cleaner way to do it, but there's more overhead involved. So right around now is when somebody here gets a clever idea and says, oh, I get it. You're telling me that having two files is a pain because your files are basically the same and there's just one little difference. I have a solution to that. It's called inheritance. Why don't I make a base class that is like input box base? Well, that'll have all the common stuff. And then I'll just override the little piece that's different in input box Android and input box iOS. And then I'll import the subclass, the correct subclass. Seems easy, right? In fact, I think it's a great solution, yeah? No, I think it's a terrible solution, okay? Because what's happening here? You're using inheritance when you could use composition. What you could have done was separate all the common things out to a component called input box common that was now wrapped in input box Android and input box iOS, okay? Which is a lot easier to reason about, a lot easier to understand, especially in JavaScript, which is only kind of sort of object-oriented, and your IDE probably doesn't really support it that well. And you know what I said, that having two files to have to find the code that you're looking for is a pain? Well, now having three files is a real pain, okay? I was there like last week. I have no idea where my code is. I don't know what overwrites what. There's code all over the place. But when you look at this component, there's no render function. How do I have a component with no render? Because the render is in the superclass. But when I look at the superclass, there's no logic. I don't know what's going on anymore. Just don't do it. I'm telling you. I used to be the guy who did these things. I thought I was so clever. I feel like an old guy. It's only 3 years in React Native, but I'm just saying. Anyway. The bottom line here is that your architecture matters, okay? How you architect your app, how you design your app, how you set up your code is going to make a big difference about in whether or not you can achieve that 85% Facebook is promising or even more. What do I mean? First of all, and Ron talked about this. Well, Ron talked about the next thing, but logic is generally cross-platform. Most of your logic is going to apply to both Android and iOS, okay? I say most because I'm trying to be conservative. I don't want to make a big statement. In my case, it was all. I don't think I had any examples in my personal work in a few years of having logic that didn't apply to one or the other. But I submit that there might be an example somewhere. But most of your differences are going to be in UI, which is why you want to keep your logic out of your views. You also want to keep your logic out of your views for what Don talked about, which is better testing. But in the context of this talk, keeping your logic out of your views is really good because it allows you to reuse your logic. And by keeping your logic out of your views become perhaps specific to one platform or another, and your logic stays cross-platform. To do this, we use presenters, dispatchers, selectors, call them whatever you will. These are the parts that Ron talked about that essentially take what you have in your state, okay? Which could be, again, a Redux or a Mobix or whatever store. It could just be some blob of data. But take whatever's there and figure out what to do with it. I call the presenters the part that take that raw data, format it, figure out what to do with it. And the dispatchers, the other side of that take the actions the user did and marshal the data, organize it, the setters, so to speak. The reason I keep these generic terms here is because there's different nomenclature depending on what kind of state management library or religion you subscribe to. So if you're in the Mobix world, then you have setters and getters. If you're in the Redux world, then you have dispatchers or actions. It doesn't matter. The point is that you have a temptation to dirty your components with logic, and you don't see it happen. It starts off very simple, okay? It starts off like it's just an if statement, or the user puts the data in the input box like this, except the server accepts it like that, and then the server actually changed, so now we need to change it. So we just make the change right here, and we just, convert the data. Like, just take this data and put it there, and then maybe we have to reformat it, and then we have to organize it, and then take data from two places. Before you know it, that's like a whole blob of code. Okay? Keep it out of your views. And then finally, there's another tool for this, which is Hox hooks and whatever else comes out. I was reading about hooks today. Hooks are pretty cool. Okay? I don't like them so much, though. I don't know. I reserve judgment. I don't want to say this because there's a camera. But, I'm not sure how I feel about hooks. Okay? Feels a bit like Hox, hierarchical components, which, for those of you who haven't had the privilege of working with them yet, are very, very clever, super clean, elegant, and entirely ununderstandable. And I say this as somebody who's written them, and you write them, and you're like, it's so great because my logic is separate, it's here, it's there, and everything's so, separation of concerns, it's beautiful. Except the next guy comes and tries to figure out what's going on, and it spends an hour, 2, 3, 4 trying to figure out a bug until the poor fellow figures out that the reason for the bug is because the hierarchical component is doing this thing and it was invisible. It introduces magic, and it's something I worry about with hooks as well. As you have a growing code base, when your code base is small and there's 3 of you, and you all know what everything is in, where everything is, it's great. Okay? In my code base, I wrote half the stuff and I have no idea where it is. And people, it's several years of cruft and redesigns and things that get changed and changes in product and pivoting, as we call it, and redeciding what we want the product to do, and then adding new modules on top and all kinds of things. And then developers leave, developers come, new team members. It's hard to follow. And keeping code simple is a really important goal. However, these tools allow you to separate your code out and make them more reusable. And herein lies the challenge. We're going to talk about towards the end about the trade-offs here. But if you have a hierarchical component, it's easier to reuse it because you have your view. Your hierarchical component just has the logic, the state manipulation, or your hook, if it's 2019. But you don't know where the code is because it's not explicit. It's not in front of your eyes when somebody complains about a bug and says this screen isn't working. The first place you go is the component. And you have to find all the different places that are impacting it. Think about this carefully. But the thing that I left on a new slide, because I think it stands on its own, is smaller modular views. And this is, I think, the most important piece of the architecture decision. If you take an app, your app, and you look at it very carefully, you look at the Android version and you look at the iOS version, and you think, wow, these are like totally different UIs. So different. And then you look again more carefully, you might realize that they're basically the same. What do I mean? What often happens is you have a UI that's 99% the same, except that last 1%, the trimming, so to speak, makes it look super different to the eye when you first see it. What happens is you have an input box, and you have a header, and you have a nav bar and a menu and this and that. And because Android and iOS have different design patterns, they're in different places on the screen. Maybe you have a tab bar here, and here you have a menu here, and things like that. Except the stuff in the menu is the same. The individual pieces are the same. They're just organized differently. If you think about your screen like a big Lego contraption, the little blocks are the same. They're just built in different ways. And if you make your views small, little pieces, then you'll be able to compose them. And you won't have to have this redundancy of code. Let's go back to the input box example. I mentioned composition briefly. Now let's get back to that. You have an input box. Okay, and maybe part of there's an input box and there's a save button. I don't know. And you think to yourself, okay, that's like one component, input and save. Except now the input needs a different design for Android and iOS. So if you make two different pieces, two different components, now you have to duplicate the save. But if you had the save in a separate component that was just included in the input, or actually a third component that wrapped it, okay, the wrapper that has the input and the save, and then a third component, now the only thing that you need to separate is just this one little piece of the input. And if you really want to go to a lower resolution, you can make just the borders be separate. You have to choose how far you go with that. But the smaller and the more modular your views, the easier it is for you to compose more complex and very different looking things with mostly the same building blocks and only very small differences. There's nothing new about this idea, by the way. This is essentially a rephrasing of the single responsibility principle, which is an old idea in software. Every function should do one thing and one thing well. That's what this is, just said for components. Every component should do just one thing. If you have a component with a lot of JSX in it, it's probably too much. If the component just does one thing, and it does only that one thing, and it does that one thing exactly right, then you'll be able to build your views in a much more reusable way. And now we get to web apps. But questions so far? Disagreements? Wow.
I have a question.
All right.
So don't you think that it should go the other way in terms of, you said that you compose the third wrapper of two components. Because like some of them, like the search button should be platform specific. But maybe you should go from this one view of wrapper, and then as you see that you have two different platform specific components, you extract the component, and like that's how you get three components instead of one, basically.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking much about the order and with which you build the thing. There are times that it makes sense to do it that way. There are times that if you see a really big component, you should probably break it up right away, in my opinion. My experience tells me that refactoring often doesn't really happen. Because, like I said about the logic in the views, they sneak up on you. It's easy to say. I used to be the guy who said no logic in views like crazy. I like Ron's rule of thumb, by the way. But it's easy to say, it's hard to do.
Well, the thing is that, okay, you have a screen, and that's where, like, when you just look at the marks of the screen, which the designer gave to you, that's when you decide how you're gonna break this screen into separate components and compose them together. Is that how you do that?
Sometimes I probably would break it up then, and then re-break it up again later, in reality. Because in reality, I'm going to discover things I didn't know. You always discover things you didn't know. The important thing is that you think about it. You won't make the right decisions, but at least you thought about it. So you didn't make the wrong decision by accident. Let's talk about web apps. This happens also frequently. We say, OK, React Native, great. I'm going to write code, and it's going to be basically the same app between Android and iOS. Everything's just going to work. But I already have a React app. I have a web app, and it's basically the same thing, right? So like, how much can I reuse? And there's a lot of confusion about this, because if you've never done React Native, you might have the wrong idea in your head. So I will try to set this straight. But I'll tell you the punchline right in the beginning. Architecture matters. How you organize your web app will make a difference in how you're going to organize your React Native app, and vice versa, depending on which one came first. And if you built your web app the way most people built their web app, then it will probably be pretty hard to reuse a lot of it. But if you build your web app from scratch, together with the React Native app, it will be a bit easier. And in our own experience, it took us till the rewrite of the web app till we could really reuse code. In my team's experience, I want to clarify something just so that there isn't any misunderstanding here. So Ron mentioned that there are about 70 developers working on the Wix app, and those are separated into many, many teams. And what I say here, just like Ron said, what he says is his personal opinion, at least some of it. What I say here is pretty much all my personal opinion based on my experience in my team. in Wix, which is the chat team. But there are other teams that have done things very differently. We're pretty decentralized and diverse, and I don't know. Feel free to disagree if you think, if your experience tells you otherwise. This is what I had for the last few years. This is what I learned. But other teams have tried other things. Other companies have tried other things, and maybe, I don't know. Maybe there's a better way. But I'll tell you what I learned, and I hope it has some value to you. And one of the things that happened to us was when we first started our React Native chat, it was hard to reuse stuff from the web. It was not built for it. But then when we had to do a rewrite anyway, in round 2, we did a much better job taking the lessons I'm about to share with you and actually being able to share serious portions of the code. What do we have to do? Well, first of all, we have to accept that our UIs will be completely separate. Okay? This is just the baseline. There have been projects that attempt to take a React Native view and make it render on the web, or vice versa. I haven't even tried them. Okay? That's how much I believe in them. Because it's kind of like, oh, we can do this just because we can. But really, your web UI is different than your native view. React Native does not even attempt to say that, like, this is not PhoneGap. We don't attempt to say, oh yeah, no problem, just take your web app and make it into a native app, because that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a native app that looks native, that feels native, that is native, that interacts like a native app. So having the same UI is not even the goal. The goal is to have a UI that feels and looks and interacts natively, and the goal on the web is to have a web UI. And so far, anything I've seen, any clever, way to somehow magically convert a React Native view into a web view and vice versa, in my opinion, misses the point. Keep your UI separate, accept that you have a different UI, but because you kept your logic out of your views, you'll have reusable application logic. But first, let's talk about always creating a separate module. Always create a separate module. Okay, this is something that also comes up sometimes in questions. Can you have one repo? Yeah, you can have one repo. You can have a monorepo. But you don't want to have one NPM module that has your web app and your React Native app. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, you could hopefully optimize your way out of the mess you made by tree shaking, but they don't go together. Okay, you need to have a web app, React Native app, and then your shared stuff somewhere else in a third NPM module. And that third one will have your reusable application logic, the brain of your application. What does this mean? I don't know. I mean, it might be your whole Redux store. Okay, it could be that you can take an entire Redux store, an entire Mobix store, and just drop it in, and boom, you're done. In reality, it's usually not, because your store also knows about flows and actions that happen in the application, and people interact with the web app differently. There's different actions, different CTAs, different things you can do with the web app and the native app. So unless your native app is really a one-to-one mirror of your web app, then dropping the whole store in probably doesn't make sense either. You need to find the level of logic at which the stuff is common. Maybe it's the services. Maybe it's a lower level store and there's a wrapper store. You need to think about this. You need to think about it from the beginning, because if you make a big ball of mud for your web app, then it'll be really hard to make that web app work for your native app, or vice versa. If you think carefully in the beginning about how you can separate your pieces out and say, okay, this is the stuff that is for the web, this is the stuff that's for native, and this service is shared, you pull it out into a separate NPM module. From day one, you'll have an easier time of it. But you need to know that now you entered a little bit of a pain. Why? Because the web needs different things than React Native. React Native, for example, React Native modules, if I'm building a React Native app, I want to import something, NPM module, I don't want it compiled. I don't want it transpiled. I want it in ES 7+. I want it as nice, because I know the packager will take care of it. The React Native packager comes and just compiles everything for me and makes it into one nice bundle. And I like my node modules to be raw and readable. But the standard in the web world is not that. The standard in the web world is, well, I need to compile your code. That doesn't make sense. How am I supposed to know which Babel plugins you want, how to configure your Webpack? This shared piece of code that was going to work for the web and for mobile, I don't know how to make it look. How do I publish it? Do I publish it raw? Do I publish it compiled? If I publish it compiled, the React Native people get upset. If I publish it raw, the web people get upset. So in some cases, in our example, in our case, in some of our modules, we actually publish 2 different distribution packages so that everybody's happy. It's a pain, okay? And you have to fiddle with it. And then there's another consumer that can't use ES5. They can only use I don't know what, CommonJS or something, some other kind of format they need. And you have to always think about all these different use cases. And the last part that really is annoying is linking. Does anybody here know what npm link is? Anybody not know what npm link is? Okay, I'll tell you. So let's say you have 2 modules, because I told you have to create a separate module. So you have now, let's just say you're only working on the native side. So you're working on the native code. You're working on React Native stuff, and then, ooh, I need to make a change in the part that I separated out into the common stuff. Except now it's in a different place. It's not part of your React Native app. So you have 2 options. One is you go into your node modules and you make a change. Except now what? Now you made a change in node modules. How do you commit that to source control? Well, you copy, paste, you do crazy things. I don't know. You're confused. So another option you have is you go to your other place on your local machine, and where you develop your library, so to speak, let's call it, and you make changes there. Except now you can reload as many times as you want in your React Native simulator, and you don't see the change. So what you can do now, you're going to make the change, commit it, publish, reinstall everything in npm, and hope everything worked. Oh crap, I forgot something. I made a typo. Okay, now I got to fix it. So comes npm link and says, this is no problem. What we'll do is we'll set up a symlink from the consuming library to the source library. Okay, the consuming library is node module to the source. When you make a change in the source, the consuming library just sees it directly. And so you can now develop the library and the consumer, so to speak, on one machine together at the same time. It's great. It really is great. There's one problem. It doesn't work with React Native. And, okay, it used to not work officially with React Native because React Native Packager didn't follow symlinks. And then there was some new version of React Native, and it did work. Or at least what they said, but I don't know. Sometimes it works, okay? Sometimes it works, sometimes I feel like this. Okay? And I'm not the only person. Everybody on my team is always saying that yeah, it works until it stops working. You don't know if it works. If you use Yarn, sometimes it works better than if you use NPM, but sometimes if you use NPM, it's fine. Okay, some people have given up already and just copy-paste the code each time. I don't know. I don't have a solution. I'm just telling you that it's hard, okay? Which leads me to the last section, which is what happens when you have multiple projects. You have multiple React Native projects. Maybe you want to reuse your code across those, or maybe you just have one React Native project, but you want to share some of your code with other React Native projects in open source. Well, the same principle. Architecture matters, okay? In Wix, I can't remember who coined this phrase of open source from day one, but it was popular in the React Native world at Wix, which is basically says, if you start your code, if you start your whatever thing you're doing open source, it will stay open source. If you don't, it won't. What do I mean by this? This is a very common pattern, which is that somebody says, okay, we need in our app, I don't know, a camera kit, okay? We need something with camera. But there isn't something out there, so let's make one. And so they build it right inside the app, okay? If they do that, then they say, oh, you know, there's nothing really super specific to our app about this. We could probably separate it out and make it open source, yeah? It's a bit too late. Not too late, but it's a lot of work now. What happens? You accidentally leaked your logic into the component. It's too tightly baked to your specific use case. It's hard to separate out. And also you're embarrassed. You don't know, should I separate it out? I didn't finish all the tests. It's not polished. I don't know. It might not look good. I don't really want to publish it. Let me first fix it up, and then I'll publish it. Yeah. It's like a to-do in code, okay? We all know what that means. So if you do open source from day one, you avoid all those problems. When you do open source from day one, you get over the shame, so to speak, of imperfect code. It's not supposed to be perfect. You just started. You said, I want to make a camera kit. You go right away, you start out, and you say, I'm going to make a camera kit. It's going to be separate. It's going to be open source. What does this force you to do? It forces you to always think what belongs in the camera kit open source and what belongs in my application. What's common to the whole world belongs there. What belongs in my application belongs in my application. You now have cleaner architecture. It's easier for you to separate things because you're forced to. So are things good? Of course not. You have to deal with binaries. In the old world of plain JavaScript, you didn't need to think about transitive dependencies. If I'm a builder of some library, and I decide, you know what, I'm going to take this piece out and just separate it into another library, no problem, I could do that. Like, let's say I have some code, and in the code it has to pad zeros on the left of the string, right? No problem. I'll just make a left pad. And nobody will even know left pad exists until I unpublish it. But in React Native, that doesn't work. Transitive dependencies are now not invisible. Why? Because sometimes they have binaries. And if I want to use your library, and your library has native code in it, true native code, then I need to now deal with that. I need to link those binaries. I need to worry about them. I need to maintain all that. It's a whole piece of overhead that isn't natural to JavaScript developers who are used to just doing npm install. On top of that comes dependency hell. Versions can bump into one another. Versions are not always compatible with one another. This is only compatible with this specific version of React Native. Or this has native code, native binaries that can't deal with those native binaries. Or if you don't deal with the correct version of native binaries, then you won't be able to upgrade my npm package. And so that's a whole nother level of overhead that you have to deal with. And what I have found having to deal with all those things is that I don't really know what I'm doing. And I suspect most people don't either. I'm not sure about that, but I suspect. And so I caution you. What's all this to say? Basically, I give you a very negative picture, yeah? Everything sucks, right? Which isn't entirely true. You know, things are good, like,
Sometimes it works.
yeah, sometimes it works, right? Sometimes, yeah, sometimes you debug and it turns out that the bug you had isn't really on you, you know? So there's good things in life. But no, seriously, there's a lot of trade-offs here. This is what I'm trying to present to you here. Can you get 85% code reuse from React Native? Absolutely. At least in the parts of your logic, probably higher than 85%. Will you have to work for it? Yes. Between Android and iOS, you won't have to work that hard. You just have to be responsible. Keep your logic out of your views. Don't do stupid things. You know, yeah, you'll have some hawks. You'll have some hooks. You'll have state here. You'll have a store that isn't super clear. But if you basically follow best practices, so to speak, and you don't clutter up your views with tons of component lifecycle things and then all kinds of junk and make these huge views that have tons of things in it, you'll be okay. And you'll get a good chunk of code reuse. But when you move to the next level of trying to reuse with your web app, you really need to think. And there's pain involved. There's complication. You end up with a lot of modules. You end up with my web application, my native application, my common application, my thing that's only common to my application, but the thing that's common to all the different consumers of the similar code, the open source. Now, every time you go into work every morning, you're working on 6 different modules. Just the other day, one of my coworkers is sitting there looking at me like, how am I supposed to work? I don't even know where any of this stuff is, right? And he knows what he's doing. It's difficult. There's a lot of overhead involved in this. Is it worth it? That's a conversation. That's a question you need to ask yourself. But you need to go into it with your eyes open to understand how much it will cost, okay? And don't go crazy in the beginning. At the same time, when you see that you're gonna grow, and I don't mean grow in terms of how many millions of users you have, but grow in terms of how much you have in your app, then you might want to seriously think about organizing your code in a way that will make it reusable. I'll give you a few examples, and I'll take questions. One of the things that was very important, one of the, I would say, brightest things that in our team we did, and I don't take credit for this, it was somebody else's decision, was that we had to interact with Firebase, okay? For some feature of our code. And to do it, both our web app and our native app would have to, and this is at the time when our web app was still in Angular, and our web app was React Native. But they both have to do a lot of similar logic. We pulled that out into a separate library. Okay, it's maybe 3 or 4 files plus tests, so like 15 files. But it has a lot of logic in it that works. Okay, 100% test coverage. There's only logic in it. There's nothing. There aren't complicated things like native pieces that are hard to test. It's pure JavaScript, and it hasn't really been touched in about 3 years, and it still runs in production, which is pretty incredible. Okay. And I say that as testament to just how good that decision was, to pull out that facade, so to speak, to Firebase. And it wasn't the Firebase facade. At the time, it was just the real-time facade, because we weren't even using Firebase when we did this. We were using a different service. Then we transitioned from that service, from a whole other backend to Firebase, without changing the API there. And it was completely transparent to both the web app and the native app. Everything just worked. It was wonderful. Okay? That's an example of when it makes sense to pull things out. Of course, when you have to make changes there, you have to remember to go there. Another thing is that the rewrite, or the second rewrite of our chat app, we basically pulled the entire brain of the chat out into a core library that's just JavaScript that's reused on multiple different web apps as well as our native app, and works pretty well. And this was only possible also because we learned the hard way about what it's like when you have all your Redux stores and everything so tightly reached into your components. When you keep things nice and clean and separate, it's easier to reuse them. In fact, one of the design principles we used when we did this was not to expose internally. This library uses Redux, and we do not expose that to consumers. So we didn't want the web app and the native app to have to know that our core library is even using Redux. Why? Because we know that Redux will go out of fashion, and then it already happened. And Mobix will come in, and then after Mobix, there'll be, I don't know, Schmobix or something else. And we don't want to make all the consumers tightly coupled to have to connect directly to our store. So instead, we make an interface. Okay? Now, that's probably over-engineering for most cases. When it's the third time that you're rewriting your app and you've dealt with the pain, you think about these things. But I want you to start thinking about the architecture now, because the architecture matters. Think about it. You won't always know the answer to your point, I think. Sometimes you're going to make the wrong decision, okay? Because you don't know the future. You don't know where your app's going to go. You don't know how many times you're going to redesign, your product's going to change. But at least make that decision on purpose. Make the wrong decision on purpose instead of making the wrong decision just because you didn't even think about it. All right? That's the bottom line. The architecture matters. Thank you.